Hi, good evening. Please can I welcome everyone to this extraordinary meeting of the Health and Environment Policy Committee taking place from the Walton Suite in the Winchester Guildhall. The time is 6:30. My name is Councillor Steve Cremoyson. I'm chairperson of this meeting. This meeting is being live streamed and recorded to the Council's YouTube channel. Subtitles are available and advice on how to turn this on is set out on our website. Can everyone please ensure that mobile phones are on silent, and in the unlikely event that it is necessary to evacuate the building, the fire alarm will sound. Please follow all the instructions given to you by our team. And can I welcome members of the public and visiting councillors to the meeting? And I will invite you forward when it is time for you to make your contribution. I also welcome anybody who's online watching on the YouTube channel. So now turning to the agenda, and we'll start with apologies and deputy members. Matthew, can you just bring us up to speed?
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, Chair. Good evening, members. So we've had apologies from Councillor Warren this evening, and also apologies from Councillor Tippett Cooper, who's been replaced by Councillor Brophy this evening, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Now, as Councillor Tippett Cooper is the usual Vice Chair, I'm looking for nominations for a Vice Chair. Councillor Wise.
I'd like to propose Councillor Morris.
Thank you. Do we have a seconder? Got two seconders. Thank you, Councillor Greenberg and Councillor Brophy. So, Councillor Morris, if you'd like to find your way up here, and we will wait for you. Right, well, we're waiting for Councillor Morris. Have we got any declarations of interest? I'm not aware of anybody who usually makes those, so I think we're clear on that. Moving on to item 3, Chairperson's announcements. I'm going to use this slot to reference the supplementary agenda, which is the minutes of the last meeting, which were held on the 6th of December. And I'm just looking around here to see if we can get validation from councillors that those minutes are sound and good. So I have a few nods. Anybody objecting? Not seeing any objections, so we'll take those minutes as read. Thank you. Right, we don't have anybody from the public here for public participation. So we'll now move on. Excuse me while I just juggle a few papers. We'll move on to the actual formal primary agenda item tonight, which is the future of waste and recycling, which has been an ongoing programme, which has been to the Health and Environment Policy Committee already once this council term, and probably was last council term, and was certainly in the previous year in an earlier iteration. So this is an evolving story. So we have two visiting councillors who wish to speak, Councillor Wallace and Councillor Lee, both from Central Mill Valley, I think. Could one of you come forward and express the views you want to express to the committee, any questions you particularly want us to try and pick up, and so on?
Thank you, Chair. As councillors know, this is one of my favourite topics. I had to come here and put some comments in. I know how important recycling is to our residents, and I know how much effort the waste management officers at Winchester are putting into improving our waste collection service. So it's a good thing. I was really excited to see how many people replied to the survey, and it just reflects how much people care about this topic. I just had quite a short bit. I just wanted to ask a couple of questions. A question really. The key target date for having a new waste management process in place is end of March 2026. There's some other dates around that, but it's end of March 2026 is the key date. The two key risks to achieving that date appear to be completion of Hampshire's new MRF and availability of new of waste collection vehicles. I'd like to ask, what is the council doing to manage each of those risks? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wallace. Nice and clear and succinct. Thank you. Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Chair, for allowing me to speak. I hope my comments will inform the debate tonight, and I look forward to the reply to my questions, and also just to say I'm pleased to see the great response from the public survey. Of course, we're now very much into the process for determining the best way ahead for the waste management and recycling after so many delays. The reasons for delays in rolling out a better service are understood, very disappointing and frustrating for everyone. I think it's worth reminding ourselves why the best waste management and collection for recycling is so important. Recycling is not just about keeping our streets clean and neat, plus keeping us safe from ensuring vermin don't multiply because of inappropriate managed waste. For many, the biggest issue is dealing with the nature and climate crisis whilst reducing our ecological footprint and the circular economy. So reducing waste and recycling is therefore key for the natural resource support for our lifestyle and prosperity. Recycling not only protects our environment, but the dwindling natural resources we all rely on. Waste prevention, reuse, recycling, recovery, and finally disposal is of course our waste hierarchy. But we all need to rethink our relationship with waste and consumption and what we consume based on these 5 priorities ranked in terms of what's best for the environment. Can I therefore ask for reassurance we're not going to be losing sight of the need for parallel messaging about the right consumption with least impact as we introduce our new future waste recycling service? A quick example, 1 ton of new paper requires 2 to 3 tons of wood, which translates into 28 to 49 trees. Okay, recycling more paper helps reduce take of virgin wood, but better to avoid the take in the first place, preserve the trees for climate change, carbon sequestration, and nature. Similar analogies can be applied to a myriad of products and materials we use and consume. I'd like to finish by sharing the comments from Dr. Jenny Dixon, a Central Meon Valley Hambledon resident. She missed the opportunity to contribute to the public engagement survey, and she's apologized for that. She says, Winchester must start recycling much more, make the process simpler, and put an end to plastic pollution. We, she's talking about herself, dispose of recyclable items to 5 separate locations and our home Winchester green bin as follows. Hard plastic to the Wimbledon Village bin collection point. Blister packs to a Hambledon resident who takes them to Superdrug. And note, not all Superdrug chemists and stores take these. Tetra packs and clothes for charity to bins in Denmead. Recyclable soft plastic to Sainsbury's in Waterlooville or the local co-op or even M&S. And many other items are collected once a month at the Hambledon Church, courtesy of the Hambledon Greening Group, where they collect many recyclable items not allowed in the Winchester Limited Recycling green bins. Or they serve as an easy access for less mobile residents. She didn't mention the Scouts Recycling Centre in Denmead that collects toothbrushes, Pringle tubes, coffee pods, spectacles that aren't recyclable in green bins. And she emphasises there are just too many confusing choices about what can and cannot be recycled and the different locations. This leads to many residents giving up or they dispose of the wrong items in a green bin, which means the whole mixed waste is treated as non-recyclable waste. I believe Dr. Dixon's comments chime with the wider public survey findings to highlight the need for consistent and comprehensive and easy to understand recycling options from least number of sites and not for us to rely entirely on goodwill. So can I ask if the new waste in recycling service will overcome the confusion and reduce sites for recycling? Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Just turn your mic off. Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Lee. I, having had prior sight of the presentation, suspect that Dr. Dixon will be pleased with the direction hopefully with the extent and the speed. But as ever, you know, no matter how far you go, there's always going to be other things which can't be recycled in the main bin and may have to find other ways. And then that will lead to campaigners to challenge the councils to go even further, which will be a delight to see. So thank you, councillors Wallace and Lee. I'm going to hand over to, I suspect the cabinet member may like to respond to some of those points, and then I think we'll hand over to Campbell Williams, who will take us through the main presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Actually, I think those questions are most appropriately dealt with after the presentation. So I have them written down, and then if we can pick them up at the end, I think it'll make a lot more sense to anybody who's paying attention. As members will be aware, there has been a lot that has happened since we last presented on this in June. In particular, the government finally announced the results of its consistency consultation and told us what we were going to have to recycle under the simpler recycling banner, which in itself was, I think, reassuring to most of us. We have undertaken significant consultation, and we'll talk about the results of that today, but I really don't want to steal Campbell Williams' thunder, so I will hand over to our lead for environmental services, Campbell.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Lerny. I am going to try and share my screen. So hopefully you can see that. So yes, I'm going to talk for not too long, hopefully, about waste and recycling, and it's a really interesting and changing subject at the moment. So the purpose of this presentation is twofold. Firstly, it's to note the progress that we've made and the developments which have happened since June 2023. And secondly, it's to provide comments and discussion points that we can include in a cabinet decision paper on how we take this forward on the 8th of February. So that paper has not been written yet, and it's an opportunity for this group still to input into that. Just take you back a little bit, where we were in June when I last came to this committee. We were talking about what we did at the moment in Winchester, so I won't talk through all that because you all know we've got an alternate wheelie collection, a glass bin and a garden waste service. But at the point in June, as Councillor Lerny said, we were still uncertain about what we'd have in the future, and whether we need food waste or whether we might have absorbent hygiene product collections or paper and card bins or what have you. And what was really helpful is that since that point, a number of quite significant things have happened. So I'm going to talk you through some of those in turn, which will set out where we go next. So some really key things, and these are the things I'm going to talk through, and I'll talk through them all in a bit more detail. So the government's released the results of its consistency consultation, which followed on from its consultations on extended producer responsibility and the deposit return scheme. As a result of that, the County Council's identified some key next steps, and we work with the County Council as we're the Waste Collection Authority and they are the Waste Disposal Authority, so we work closely with them. The City Council has undertaken a resident survey, and I'll talk through the results of that. We have undertaken modelling on a range of different options which we could take forward, and I'll talk through the results of that. And we're starting to develop some financial estimates of the cost involved, which is really important for local authority funding. And we've recently just had some indicative capital funding from DEFRA. And all of that leads forward to some outline timetables and some potential ways forward, which is what I'll discuss with you. So first of all, whilst the Environment Act in 2021 introduced consistent recycling, a feature of that was separate collections, so potentially a number of different bins. But following consultation, and I think it took 2 years for the consultation results to be announced, the government introduced what it termed simpler recycling in October 2023. And the things in there which are of most relevance to us, and there are other things, but the really key things were that it's identified that we will be introducing across England a food waste collection service funded through New Burdens funding from the government with a limit of a once a week collection. The second thing that was significant is that it said that the commingling of recycling was an acceptable concept. So that previously, when it had been discussing the introduction of recycling in more materials, one of the ideas was about increasing quality in recycling, and you can do that by having different bins for different types of materials. But on review of the evidence, the government came to the conclusion that a commingled collection service was okay. The third thing that was really important for us is that the simpler recycling consultation put a limit on how frequent or infrequently you can collect residual waste. So those are currently collected for majority of our residents in black bags on a fortnightly basis, or black bins on a fortnightly basis. And there are some authorities who collect that on a 3-weekly or 4-weekly basis, and that would have been an option open to us, but that is no longer an option open to us. So those are the three things that really changed what we could do. So as a result of those simpler recycling announcements, the County Council, with whom we work closely, paused some of the discussions we were having about the inter-authority agreement. So that's effectively how we work with the County Council, how money moves between the two organisations. So that work needs to be continued if we're to move forward. But the County Council did say that it was going to retain the recycling income, which goes through the existing material recycling facility from April 2024, but wouldn't be introducing contamination charges from April 2024. So contamination is the wrong sort of material going through the material recycling system. What it has said is that as the Waste Disposal Authority, it will not be developing a range of collection systems. So it's going to develop one collection system for all the waste collection authorities, and it will be doing that with Portsmouth and Southampton, who are unitary authorities, so are both waste disposal and waste collection systems. And they've asked the waste collection authorities to confirm their preferred system by the 1st of March 2024. And that's the timing there is because based upon their estimate of how long it will take to build a material recycling facility, being 2 years, that's the timescale which they need to have some decisions made by in order to get to the deadline, which Councillor Wallace mentioned earlier, about 2026 March. The final thing they said is that they will be providing the food waste disposal system, but that will be a food waste disposal system. That won't be a food and garden waste disposal system. Those two will remain separate, and that is an option. You can keep them separate under the government guidance, but they're not going to go down that route. So those are some quite significant things. Now, what was interesting in this was we were expecting this timing to happen. So we were getting ready and we did some public engagement. A number of you will have responded to this engagement and this survey, which went out to the Winchester residents. And it was really very gratifying to see the number of people who responded to this. I was gobsmacked, frankly, that we had 8,500 people have responded. There are 57,000 households in Winchester. There's over 100,000 people. That's a really high return rate compared to, that's really impressive. And what that means is, apart from me being gobsmacked, what it means is it gives us a really representative sample from all sorts of age groups, all sorts of types of households, all types of residents. And it gives a lot of validity to those responses. And actually, it means we've got enough capacity from those responses to look in those in a bit more detail, and are still doing so because there's so much data. So that gave us a lot of answers, and I think if you look at what Councillor Wallace said, I think it was Councillor Lee said about his contact, that reflects what people want really, which is residents want to do more, residents want recycling to be easier, and residents find the current system confusing. So I'll talk through our evidence of that. One of the really interesting things I think in here is that we had 8,500 responses. One of the last questions was, if we get in contact with you again, would you like to leave your email address? And we can ask you some more questions of a different type as we build this forward. So we've got about 5,500 people said yes. So we've got about 5,500 email addresses of people who we can contact and talk to about waste and recycling. And that's going to be really helpful in developing a system which works for everybody. So the government is telling what we've got to bring in, what we have to bring in. It's not telling us how we have to do it. And you know, we've got an opportunity with those people to talk to them and find out what we're going to, how we're going to do this. So just going to take you through a few of the responses. I think you've all got this on hard copy or on your laptops anyway, so if you can't see it, please follow it up later. I'm not going to talk through them all individually, but you can see the scale of responses we've got. So of the 8,500 people who responded, for example, 6,500 people said it's really important, very important to recycle at home. What's interesting is that only 2,500 of those were really clear about what goes in the bin at the moment. So there's a job there to get more clarity on what goes in the bin, what doesn't go in the bin. And almost everybody is very keen to have plastic waste, food pots, tubs, and trays in that mix, which is really interesting. Some very big numbers. We asked lots of other questions, and an interesting one, which reflects the plastic one, was that what persuades people to recycle more, a wider range of materials, a clearer explanation of how to do it, and more plastic waste are the ones which came out on top, which is really interesting. And whilst not quite as supportive as the plastic waste question, still people by and large are very supportive of food waste being introduced, which is good because we've got to do it. Couple of interesting questions about how full people's bins are, how full are their recycling bin, how full are their black bin. And the reason these questions are interesting is because if we're going to change the mix of what goes in your recycling bin and add different things in, we want to make sure there's capacity to do that. And we want to make sure we're able to do that in a way which people are happy with. At the moment, if you live in a household with 6 or more people in, you can get a second black bin. We're allowed to have a second one. Do we need to change that? Do we need to do that with recycling bins, for example? Those are the sorts of things which this data will help us to do. So 3 graphs which go into a bit more detail on these, which are quite interesting. So this one is really interesting. So we asked a lot of questions about, can you recycle a material? So can you recycle cardboard at the moment? And 98.2% of people know they can recycle cardboard. Only 85% of people know they can recycle magazines. And only 45% of people know they can recycle aerosols, which you can do. So what's interesting, there was only 900 people out of the 8,500 who got all those questions right. I'm sure a good percentage of those are in this room. But there is a degree of uncertainty from lots of people about this. And that's what the government is trying to change, so that everybody knows that wherever you go in the country, you know what you can recycle in your curbside recycling collection. And so it's going to be really interesting to see how the government communicates this. And it's one of the things we'll have to do, is communicate that as we change the system, this is what you can recycle, this is what you can't recycle, and make it as clear to people as possible. And that's a really interesting one. So what's quite interesting is, lots of things are interesting, but one of the reasons that helps is this graph shows that if you were one of the 901 people who got all those questions right, or if you're one of the people who got 1 or 2 of them wrong, the fullness of your recycling bin is less than the people who didn't get it right, which you can read a number of things into, but and we'll need to do more work on this, but that suggests that if you're recycling the wrong thing at the moment and you're putting plastic pots, tubs, trays and cartons in the recycling bin, it suggests that actually your bin should be, is fuller, which is a really interesting finding. So I think if we are going to introduce more material into the recycling and we communicate it well, there is potentially capacity from people whose bins may be full at the moment because they might not be putting the right thing in the right bin. One of the other things which is really interesting is from the range of responses we got, and this is just one question, which is how helpful would it be if you had a notification by email or text message the night before your collection to tell you? I would love that because I'm awful at it. I can never remember. But this is just a really helpful guide that if you ask people who are under 55, they're at least 50% happy with that as a concept. If you ask people who are over 65, they're less familiar with that concept. So I think, from my point of view, what that tells us is we've got enough data to start to think about how we target communication to different people in different ways, so that we're not treating everybody across Winchester as the same person. And we've got to make sure we, if we're going to roll this out properly, we roll it out in a way which is suitable for everyone. Because not everybody lives in a detached house, in a particular way. We've got lots of people who live in shared properties, communal properties, houses of multiple occupation. So we can work with that to make sure that's done in a good way. So, so the third thing which I wanted to talk through is, because we knew this was going to be an issue, was we've worked with a consultant called WSP, which used to be a consultancy called Wood, on modelling some of the options which we have got for our waste service. So this excludes things that the government says we can't do, like a 3-weekly residual service, but they're all modelled on comparative costs and benefits of different options against the current baseline and comparable with what other authorities do, and this is consistent with what a lot of other authorities are doing. So Hampshire and the Project Integra Partnership are doing this at the moment to see how this works across Hampshire as a whole. But we've done this and we've got the results back, so I'll talk you through some of those. So just in terms of the key options that we modelled, as I said, we modelled our baseline, which is what we do now. And we modelled 2 options where you have an additional recycling container. So in this case for paper and card, so collect paper and card either on a 2-weekly basis or on a 4-weekly basis. And we also measured what happens if you put all the recycling into one bin, and either collected that on a fortnightly or on a weekly basis. And so what you'll see on the following pages is some graphs which show what the outcomes of that is. Before I go on to the graphs, a few key things are the highest recycling rate was around 57% for any of the options we looked at, which is in line with what other authorities towards the top end of performance do, and how you do in terms of, do you go above that, do you go below that? That's really about how you engage with your community and how you communicate it and how you get them to work well with you. The other thing is that the frequency of recycling collections from the modelling that's been done tends not to change the recycling level. So if you recycle more frequently, it doesn't necessarily have a result on the recycling rate. Some of the key things are about costs. Weekly collections are more expensive for us because you've got more trucks on the road. So collecting a commingled collection is cheaper than collecting in 2 bins, which is logical and makes sense. So the cheapest 2-bin collection system or 2 recycling bin collection system is about £500,000 more expensive than a commingled system, which is about £900,000 to £1 million more expensive than what we have at the moment. And that's largely because that includes a food waste collection service. So a lot of work to be done on that, but from the modelling that we've done, those modelling results are sort of shown here, with the commingled service, which is number 4 in this one, which has a weekly food waste collection, a fortnightly residual waste collection, and a fortnightly recycling collection, coming in as the one which is cheapest with the joint highest recycling rate. The other options have a similar recycling rate, but the costs vary because the number of vehicles moving around Winchester would vary. So those with more frequent collections or more bins have a higher cost, which is logical when you work it through. So that's really helpful to going to some potential options going forward. The next bit is talking about finance and some of the finances we're getting or we've got. So if you remember, one of my earlier slides talked about recycling income from the county council. So they're going to stop recycling income from the dry mix recyclables we collect in 2024, but they won't be charging contamination for us. The second bit or third bullet point there, it outlines new burdens funding. So what this means is the government appreciates that this introduction of food waste is a cost to local authorities, so is allocating a new burdens fund to all local authorities across England who would be beginning to collect food waste. So we got a letter as a local authority last week setting out an indicative level of what that was going to be and the costs which would be allocated to us for the costs of vehicles and kitchen caddies and curbside bins and communal bins, which was around £1.3 million in capital. So we're going to get that sort of figure and are now working through our finance team to have that sent to us. Another source of income is extended producer responsibility. We are still in line to get an extended responsibility payment, which is the contribution that the producers of packaging waste would make to local authorities to cover the cost of curbside collections and from collections from street litter bins. So that's potentially quite a significant sum. We don't know how much that is. We're on schedule to get told how much that is in November 2024. And we would start receiving the money from April 2025. And we are planning in our medium-term financial strategy for some capital expenditure and for some revenue expenditure. So there's a whole load of financial information which we're working through. And what that leads us towards is a timetable, which are some of the dates I've mentioned before. So if you look at this, we've got a cabinet date of this next month in February to discuss some of these options. The county council deadline for making a decision by all the WCAs is the 1st of March, and we're working with Project Integrate to do that. Government's announcement of funding for food waste, we've just had this, but when I sent the slides out, we haven't had it, so that was due by the end of this financial year, and we've now had that bit. Government, as I said, EPR funding by November 24. Importantly, the deposit return scheme is going to be introduced in October 25. That's still on schedule, and that's a big uncertainty. Because if we're talking about, for example, having a commingled recycling system in one bin and capacity potentially being an option, if we introduce that after the deposit return scheme has come in and tin cans and plastic bottles have gone out, well, we've got more capacity, but we don't know exactly how much that will be. So it's quite difficult to make judgments. And then food waste recycling is going to be mandatory by the end of March 2026. And the government's target date for recycling is April 2026. So there are other dates on here. The government is proposing and on schedule to introduce other bits of recycling after 2026. So aluminium foil, I think, and plastic film in 2027. But those are the key dates for us. Now, the interesting bit is on the right-hand side of there. There's some core time constraints. If we're going to buy some vehicles to collect food waste, at the same time as the rest of the country is going to be buying vehicles for food waste, there might be a long procurement timetable. One of the reasons we're coming to Cabinet shortly is so we can get in as soon as we can, having had the money from the government to start buying those and get ahead of the queue of people. And we've also got the advantage, we're working with BIFA, who have some significant buying power and expertise in this. So hopefully we're trying to get to the front of the queue without queue jumping, but by trying to go as quickly as we can. Another time constraint is, as I mentioned, a 2-year build period for the material recycling facility, and understanding the planning processes and the build phases that needs to go through. And another thing with vehicle procurement is if we are interested in having electric vehicles for some or all the rounds, how do we engage the right infrastructure to charge and manage that electric vehicle system? And if we're going to do this, do we do it all on day one, or do we phase it in over a number of months? The thought of doing all this on one day gives me kittens, but if we phase it, it takes much longer. So, you know, some real big core time constraints on here. So, what I'm sort of coming to the end of these couple of slides, last two slides. So I think this is now moving to a bit of a next steps in discussion. And as I said, you know, the purpose of this was to input into the cabinet paper, which we're now writing. I came to HEP about 6 months ago, had a really sensible, engaging discussion. It was really helpful in setting the structure going forward. And hopefully we'll do the same again here, because residents and the council are clearly wanting to improve their recycling rates. We've got to respond to legislative changes. There's other people we need to work with to do this. We're not on our own. We've got to work with the county council. We've got to work with waste collection authorities. We've got the opportunity to work with Biffa, our contractor. We've got lots of data from residents about what they want to do. We've got lots of modelling that shows what's possible. There's still uncertainty about how much money we'll get from this, and that uncertainty is going to continue for at least a year probably. But we know we need to introduce a weekly food waste collection service, and we know we need to decide the best way to collect all the other recycling. So the real sort of, I guess, key questions I'm after from this meeting is you raising what the opportunities, concerns and issues are that you see going forward, getting your inputs on how we phase this, how we roll it out, how we engage people, how we communicate it with people, and understanding what the ambition is to reduce carbon from this service and the issues that might be needed to consider in order to do that. So that's my last slide, and really happy to open up for discussion or debate as needs be.
Thank you, Campbell, for that presentation covering all the bases. I can see Councillor Loney would like to come in. I was going to ask you if you'd like to come in and just add any further remarks.
Can I just check quickly? Is it worth me stopping sharing this now so we can see people?
I think if you just keep your slides on there, because I have a hunch we may have folks may want to go back to the slide, particularly on the one where you were comparing all the different options. That one I think needs some further explanation. So Lenny, would you like to come in?
Thank you, Chairman. I did want to come back to the questions that were asked by the visiting councillors earlier. So Councillor Wallace asked about, given that the key target date is March 2026 and the key risks are the Hampshire County Council MRF and availability of vehicles, how are we mitigating those risks? I absolutely agree with him that those are the key risks to us moving forward. We have already mitigated a lot of these risks by moving forward with our modelling and consultation work without waiting for that government announcement about what we were going to be expected to recycle and what the limitations might be on that. So certainly in discussions with other districts, it's clear that we are quite a way ahead with that work. However, in terms of working with Hampshire County Council to ensure that we can have those facilities that we need to actually carry out the recycling when we deliver it to them, we do need to make sure that we are aligned with the other districts. We're certainly happy to share the work we've done with them to ensure that even if they haven't done it for themselves, they have a good idea around what they're looking at. And we do need to take a joint decision with them about what the preferred method of collection is going to be. Clearly, we have a position where our modelling indicates that full commingling will be the best solution, while cost comes into that. One of the other aspects is that although they're all various options are shown as having an equal recycling rate, In practice, the simpler you make it, we know the more things that will be recycled, rather than it just being about what you can recycle. It's about what people can easily recycle. And as is clear, people don't understand the current system. So what's in the bins is all over the place. So that's going to be important, but we do need to consider the possibility that we may need to compromise on that if that gives us a cheaper position in terms of recycling across the whole county. I think it's important that we have a recycling system that is cost effective, not only for us but for the county council. We know how difficult their financial position is, and we can't really expect what you might call cost shifting. So clearly, while they're trying to shift some costs towards us, for example, reducing our recycling income, we would like to take the high ground and not be doing the reverse and moving costs in their direction to a significant extent. In terms of availability of vehicles, that is going to be about trying to make our decisions quickly. We know we have to introduce food waste, so we do want to accelerate the decision making on that now that we know what we need to do and get at the front of the queue for those vehicles. Going on to Councillor Lee's question about parallel messaging about consumption, that reduce, reuse, recycle message is absolutely key and is something that we do need to keep putting out. We don't really want people to be proud of having a full recycling bin. We want them to be proud of not having very much in either bin, and we need to keep pushing those messages. What will be helpful there, we believe, are the new regulations that are coming in around packaging and the extended producer responsibility, which we hope will drive producers towards using less packaging and packaging that is lighter and easier to recycle, which should help in terms of the contents of those bins. So that deals with those questions, and I'm happy to take, with Campbell's assistance, any others that come forward.
Thank you, Councillor Loney. I can see we're going to have a series of questions from members. I think I've got Councillor Bolton, Councillor Brophy, Councillor Greenberg. I expect Councillor Morrison. Almost couldn't see you over there. I just got a quick question for you, Campbell, in relation to a point that Councillor Lee made in his remarks, reporting a member of his area, I think was it Dr. Dixon or Dr. Dixon, who made some comment about putting something in the wrong bin contaminates it, and then of course that completely it means you can't recycle it. Can you give us some idea of what level of contamination is, I'm not saying acceptable, but tolerated, and at what point do you have does the system say, okay, we have to just reject that particular bin, and put, if it was a green bin, it all ends up in the black bin? That would be useful to know.
Yes, so at the moment, Winchester is on about 15% of the material which goes in the recycling bin is contaminated. So the reason we know that is a sample of material from all the recycling rounds are analysed at the material recycling facility in Alton, and we get a sort of a monthly spreadsheet showing how much contamination, what that contamination is, and that's the things you know about. So it will be people putting glass in the recycling bin, which doesn't go because they think it's recycling. It would be people putting pizza boxes in the recycling bin, and they get rejected because they tend to be contaminated with food waste. People putting yogurt pots in, which they think can be recycled, or it'd be people putting the wrong thing entirely, like an engine block, in the recycling bin. So it's about 15%. It should be around 5 to 7% is a sort of sensible, if you run a good system, that's what it is. And I've been to a material recycling facility in West Sussex where it was running at about 5 to 7%. And that was a slightly different operation, but it is possible to do this with communication to make it nice and clear. We do at the moment. One of the things we have with Biffa is that they are supposed to be, and they do lift the lid up when they collect your recycling bin, have a look in it, and if it's obviously contaminated, they can reject it. That doesn't happen very often, but yeah, that's the sort of thing which we need to get better at as we roll out these schemes, is to really drive down contamination and engage with the community so they know what they can recycle and what they can't recycle, and where they can't recycle it through a curbside system, where there are alternative arrangements in place.
Thanks, Campbell. I think if I've understood that correctly, if the operators see a bin that is clearly contaminated, they can reject it, but that to some extent contamination gets sorted at the MRF, but inevitably that's a person power overhead, and potentially could lead to the rejection of other materials that have got contaminated with the contaminated waste. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. And it also, it's not just a person overhead, it costs the county council quite a lot of money as well. So if we're able to reduce contamination and run a simpler system, the cost to the county council is less, because they are not then paying for it to go through the recycling system and then be disposed of, which is expensive.
Okay, thank you. So I'll now turn to the questions. I think I've got Councillor Bolton first, then Councillor Brophy, Councillor Greenberg, Councillor Morris. Did I see Councillor Wise as well with a question? Not yet, but I'm sure you will. Okay, so Councillor Bolton.
Thank you, Chair. Absolutely excellent result on the survey. I've just got a couple of questions for you, but brilliant result on the survey. I wondered whether it was simply a reflection of the passion that the residents feel about waste recycling, or whether you did something clever that resulted in such a brilliant response. And I'd love to know. And then secondly, as Councillor Loney was mentioning about the costs through the system, one of the things that struck me when you were reading through the modelling side of things, I guess from a cost perspective, we need to understand what the overall cost is of the differences in the complete life cycle of the waste recycling, from the sort of from the curbside to the end point. And I was unclear whether the modelling was taking that into consideration, and as you touched on, the consequence of commingling is probably higher MRF costs, and I just wanted to understand and be clear how far that modelling went, and what your view was on that. Thank you.
So two questions. The first one about how we got such a high response. I think it's both of them. So I think people are genuinely interested in this, and there's a high passion from people across Winchester. Generally, there was, whilst I haven't presented it on there, and it's not going to be any of the reports, in a number of the questions, what else can we do? There was a lot of people really interested and had taken the time. So there was a huge amount of passion. So we did that. I think also it was quite a good questionnaire, and it's not my area of expertise, but it was on Facebook and advertised on Facebook and social media quite a lot. And you can target that at different communities. So we did target that at people who hadn't responded so much. So for example, we had lots of responses from people who were elderly or more old in detached properties. We had less responses from people who were younger in flats and shared properties. So we changed the targeting halfway through to target and get more people to respond from less frequent responders. Yeah, well, I think it's quite clever. You're aware of it, so it reflects on me, right? I think. But yeah, I think so. I think it was both of those. It was the passion people had, and I think our comms team did quite a good job of advising on how to get that through. I think the modelling we've done so far has been the City Council's cost and the impact on the City Council of carbon and recycling rate. You're absolutely right. we are part of a wider process. So we are working with the city council, not city council, with the county council, who are doing a very similar study. I've got a meeting tomorrow where we're going through the things which will go into the model to do this across Hampshire, to include what the Hampshire cost is, the Southampton cost, the Portsmouth cost, and the other 10 waste collection authorities. So we'll get an overall figure. And you're right. I mean, from a county council point of view, they would probably like it as simple to sort as possible. But that means it might be more expensive for the collection authorities to collect, but it might be cheaper for the county council to collect. And as Councillor Lerney said, what we want to do probably is come up with something which is the cheapest cost overall, which provides the best system for the residents of Hampshire. And coming back to one of the points that the earlier speaker said, this isn't just about recycling. This is about reducing the amount of residual waste which is produced. So personally, I don't want a high recycling rate. I want less waste produced, because that's what has the impact on carbon. That's what has the impact on the environment, rather than the high recycling rate. So you're right. We've got to work together on this with the county council to get the best result for the taxpayer, basically.
Thank you. Just to be clear as well, my view is, I think probably like yourself, is the old KISS principle. So keep it simple, stupid, because you'll get a much better response rate if it's simple, and that might be a bit more expensive. So.
Okay, Councillor Brophy.
Yeah, a little bit of overlap, I think, with Councillor Bolton's question. I was just interested in how the costs have been broken out, whether that also includes the costs at county, the blue bar charts in terms of the cost per million of the different options you've modelled. I'm also curious about, you've got things like the new burdens payments. After that runs out, are we working out any future, I suppose, CapEx costs that might come down the line if any of those trucks need replacing further down the line, and what that burden could look like compared to what we're running at the moment, and also any kind of additional OPEX costs, I guess, of running a more complex, sophisticated system. Presumably that's also offset against the EPR payments as well, which is probably a bit of an unknown. But also, if waste gets reduced further down the line, some of those revenues would decrease. So I guess the question all adds up is, that summary is something that seems incredibly complicated and multi-leveled, multi-layered, I guess. And is there any risk that, say, 10, 20 years down the line, we'll end up with a cost time bomb where we'll have to push up taxes? I mean, personally, I think we need to do this, but what are the risks that we're opening ourselves up to at future points? And how well can those be modelled realistically?
You're right. That these are things which we need to model going forward. So as I said, last week we got some indicative funding allocated to us by the government for capital funding. There are two other sources of funding that are coming to us for food waste. One is a sort of transitional fund, so that it enables us to deliver food waste funding before 2026, when we have to do it by. The second is the ongoing food waste funding from April 2026, neither of which we know how much it is, and neither of which we know what that covers. I'll give an example of why that's important. So we've been allocated some funding for food waste, curbside bins and kitchen caddies by the government. They've done a bit of work. They've worked out what it costs to buy a food waste bin or a kitchen caddy to put in your kitchen, and it's £2 for a kitchen caddy per household, and it's £102,000 for a 7.5 tonne food waste collection vehicle, all of which might be quite heroic costs in the current climate, but we've got to work our way through there and work out what we can do. What they don't include are the cost of delivery of those bins, and they don't include, for example, the costs of additional depot space so we've got somewhere safe and secure to put those bins, put those lorries. That might come in some of the transitional funding. It might come in some of the revenue funding because those aren't capital costs. But we don't know that yet. So there are some big risks included in here. But the aspiration from the government is they're going to be giving us a modelled cost of what a sensible food waste service costs on an ongoing basis. And that gets included in the Section 31 grant, which is an unring fence grant, which we would get. But that is something which, you know, could go up, could go down, or potentially, as Councillor Bolton said, it might be we want to run a service which is more expensive than a simple service, and a better service which is simpler for people, with better communication and better bins, for example, might be more expensive. So those are the sorts of things we've got to take into account in how we roll this out and understand what's important for people and what we do. But you are right. These are some big numbers, and there's quite a lot of uncertainty about this at the moment. But just to reiterate, on the graphs, that was just funding relates to our cost. We are working with the County Council on the project which relates to the whole system cost.
Supplementary. Okay. Councillor Greenberg.
Oh, so yeah, thank you, and thank you, Campbell, for that presentation. I've got a few questions, but I'll try and make them brief. Firstly, I would like to echo that it's brilliant to have such a fantastic response to this survey and to have such positivity from our residents about recycling. I think that really gives us a mandate to take this seriously and to spend money on something that we need to do. And also, it's very heartening to have an engaged population that we can, first of all, find out what they want and ask them about stuff, but you've got an engagement for that future communication and for that future education, which is going to be so important. It's really fantastic that the food waste is going to be included, because I'm sure you can, maybe you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that food waste is about 30% of our residual waste at the moment. So that's massive and such an enormous impact that's going to have on the environment. So first of all, I just had a point of clarification, which is, could I please seek reassurance for these residents who currently have clinical waste collections or additional residual waste for nappies, that will continue, because that wasn't mentioned in the presentation. Also, to do with specifics of things that are collected, there wasn't, and I know that there is some question over what's going to happen with glass, and whether we're going to continue collecting glass, or because I think there's some question over whether Hampshire wants it. So what's the current plan with glass? Is there a role for the recycling centres to reintroduce glass collections there? And or indeed, could we have an extra collection? I know that many people have noticed over the winter holiday period that there were an excess of glass items. So maybe considering one extra collection at that time, or if there are pinch points in the year. And do we have a timeline for when we'll be able to introduce soft plastics? That's something that lots of my residents are asking about, extending plastic responsibility, if we have a firm timeline on that. And then my last sort of question point is, if we're going to be having vehicles out on the road a lot more, doing more collections, particularly with a weekly food waste collection, can we please prioritise making sure that those are electric vehicles? Because we're going to have a lot of vehicles on the road polluting, and I think that should be a priority. Clearly, we have residents who are really engaged with the environment, so I think that's something that would be a priority to them too. Thank you. Sorry for so many questions, but thank you.
Those are all good questions. All been good questions so far. So just on the couple of questions on clinical waste and assisted collections. So I think there's no intention to change those at the moment. So if you currently have a clinical waste collection, or if you have an assisted collection, and if you don't know, an assisted collection is one where the bin crew will come up to your bin and take it to the lorry for you rather than you having to leave it on the curbside. So it supports people who are less mobile. So no anticipation that would change. What we do have to do is make sure that any system which we introduce is simple to use for people across Winchester. So if you live up or down steps or have a long drive, you know, is one bin easier than two bins? Well, it's probably one bin is easier than two bins. So we've got to think those things through, and that's, you know, if we're going to do this again, we probably want to consult with people just to make sure that we are introducing a system in a sensible way as much as possible. In terms of the commingled system, which is one of the options, the intention with that one would be that all the glass you currently put in your black box goes in the recycling bin, and that would get collected every 2 weeks. So we would do away with the glass black box and have a single commingled collection bin with everything going in there, so everything goes in one bin. You're right. You know, the county council is interested in having glass kept separate, so effectively doing what we do at the moment. That's part of what we are modelling with them across the whole county, because keeping glass and paper separate is a good thing if you want to reduce the cost of the disposal system, because it's more complex to operate the systems. There are lots of places which do have glass and paper commingled, which work well. So a lot of Surrey, a lot of West Sussex, the glass is mixed in with the plastic bottles, tin cans, pots, tubs, trays, and the other recycling. Regardless of which MRF is built, so I think looking forward, I think soft plastics, aluminium foil, and those are the two main things which aren't scheduled to be introduced by 2026. I think they're scheduled for 2027. If the county council is building a new MRF, I suspect they'll build it knowing that they're going to have aluminium foil and soft plastics. And if they're going to build it, they'll probably have it in there from the start, so they'll do it ahead. So that's not been confirmed yet, but the indications from the government are that those things will come in the future. So in terms of future-proofing a facility, from what they need to do, they're not going to build another facility for aluminium foil. They'll, I'm sure, build it to take that into account. And yeah, I mean, electric vehicles is a really good point. There's a number of options to introduce a more sustainable collection system. So we are looking for the moment, as an example, at using hydro-treated vegetable oil in our usual RCVs, refuse collection vehicles. Assuming the prices are right, and they are at the moment, and we'd be looking to start that in April. That is something we could do with diesel food waste trucks, and we're also, as I mentioned earlier, if we want some infrastructure for electric vehicles, we need to start thinking about that, planning that in. We're not sure at the moment if there is an electric food waste truck on the market, which is reliable and has been trialled, and that's something we're working with Biffa on at the moment to see if they are out there. Because of the interest in having that approach. So hopefully that answers your questions.
Great, thank you. I suppose the only thing that I would add about the biodiesel is that the headline seems good about biodiesel, but if we are then in competition with lots of other places that also have biodiesel, there is only so much biodiesel fuel that is available, and if we then get to a point where there isn't enough recycled oil, that does become a problem. We're having to use fresh oil for that. So thinking about how we can get off that as soon as possible, at least for one stream, so we can kind of maybe more than dip a toe, maybe like get up to thigh height on it would be good. Thank you.
If I might come up in on that, Chairman, it's certainly our aspiration to move towards electric vehicles, and certainly we see HVO as a stepping stone on the way to that. Clearly with the food waste vehicles, there is the issue about needing a considerable fleet of vehicles at one time, and also the infrastructure we need for charging and storing them. So that is something we're looking at, but we are looking to see how many food, if we were able to get electric food waste vehicles, how many could we charge using, you know, available infrastructure, and what it would take to move forward on that. So we are doing the research on that. HVO definitely is a stepping stone rather than the long-term solution on all this.
And I guess it also partly depends on how the capital funding comes through and whether that is available to be used in a few years' time rather than necessarily immediately. Councillor Greenberg, I'm not sure I heard the answer to the clinical waste part of your question. Oh, sorry, I must have been reading my notes. Apologies. And I think next up we've got Councillor Morris, who's sat next to me.
Thank you for the excellent report, and it's allayed some of my concerns. I was particularly interested in there's about 3,000 respondents who say they're currently using their recycling bin to capacity, it's full. And if we proceed with commingling, those people will be asked to be adding their glass waste to the same bin. And in some houses or particular times of the year, there's a great deal of extra glass waste along with extra recycled paper waste and cardboard and so on. And I would like reassurance that other councils already proceeded with this and there's been no adverse effects, because I can already at Christmas you see cardboard piled up alongside bins, extra stuff, or the compliance might drop that people find their recycling bin is full, so they start putting stuff in the general waste instead. As a supplementary to that, I know one of the expectations is the introduction of a deposit scheme in 2025 will allay some of that problem by encouraging people to go to the supermarket and take back their glass and their metal and so on. I would just like to raise a concern about that quite a lot of people get their food delivered by vans because they actually don't have the opportunity to drive to the supermarket to pick up food, so they will not be able to use the deposit scheme. So I would not assume that in every case that scheme is going to be allaying all of that glass waste. Thank you.
Yeah, so a couple of really interesting points there. In terms of you're right, there's a lot of people said my recycling bin is at capacity. And that's one of the key questions with this system, because we want to have something which is usable by everybody. There are other authorities which have used this system and are operating this system effectively. So an example which isn't too far away is Tandridge District Council, which is in Surrey, who have this system. They have a food waste collection, they have a fortnightly collection of residual waste and a fortnightly collection of a commingled bin of all the other recyclings, including pots, tubs, trays and cartons. So essentially how this would operate, they're on 59% recycling rate and has been operating successfully for a number of years. And there are other examples like that. I think part of what we've got to work out, if we were to roll out this, and it depends on how we work with the county council, what does happen if you have lots of cardboard or lots more waste? Where does it go? And how do we manage that? So the experience from Tandridge, and I've referenced Tandridge because I've talked to someone about that who's to answer the very question you've got, and people tend to work out that actually you need to fold your cardboard box rather than put it in as a box, and it takes up less space that way. You need to crush your plastic bottles if there's too much capacity and those sorts of things. So it does work in other authorities. We wouldn't be the first people doing this by any stretch of the imagination, but we'd have to make some decisions. So at the moment, for example, if you have more recycling than you can put in your recycling bin, which does happen even now, you can put side waste out. You can leave cardboard alongside and that will get collected and picked up. That becomes more complex to do if you've got glass in it, because you don't want to be picking glass up in plastic bags because it starts becoming dangerous to the operatives. So, how do we get around this? Can you give more recycling bins to people who have the capacity? that doesn't work because not everyone has capacity for more than one bin, for example. So those are some of the queries we've got to think about. The deposit return scheme may well solve some of those problems, which you mentioned. It doesn't include glass, the deposit return scheme. It's just plastic bottles and tin cans. So that's about 10% of the waste stream. So I think Councillor Greenberg said food is about 30% of residual waste. Paper and plastic bottles, tin cans is about 10% of the recycling mix at the moment. So that is going to come in, and that might cause a gap in the material that's space. So yeah, but yeah, uncertainty about how that will operate and exactly when that will start, but hopefully that takes us forward.
I think if I might add to that, given the example given by Councillor Lee of all the community recycling going on around him, I can guarantee there will be community people in the community who will very happily pop round all the old ladies' houses and pick up any plastic bottles they might have, if there's an easy way of putting it into a deposit return scheme recycle facility.
So I forgot that was your part of your last question. So what the government is aiming to do is to make sure that the facilities to recycle plastic bottles and tin cans just aren't on the high street, but every organisation which sells them is in a position to take them back. So it might be the co-op can do it as well. It's not just Tesco's, but I suspect when this is rolled out, exactly as Councillor Lerney said, there will be community groups or parish halls or churches or those sorts of community organisations who will realise that they get paid 1.5p for every plastic bottle they collect, and they'll say, we'll have one of those in our car park. And that's potentially how you get around it, and it's potentially something which we've got to work out how we promote those sorts of things to the Winchester community, so they can absolutely not find themselves left out of the system, and potentially it requires some input from the government into the community local to you to make sure that actually there's an income stream going forward, because the modelling at the moment is it's about 1.5p per bottle to the people who are collecting them, which might be useful for community groups going forward.
You have a supplementary on that? So you do, don't you?
I do. I mean, I'm hopeful that the supermarkets that do the deliveries will introduce some aspect of the vans picking up the waste at the same time. That would make sense. Let's see. Where's it gone? Okay.
Yeah, I think you're raising an interesting point there, Councillor Morris, about some people who may not have the opportunity to recover the extra costs that they're incurring in goods through the DR deposit. Well, the result of the product being more expensive because it has to include the funding for the DRS. Did you have your supplementaries come popping back into?
Yeah, the supplementary is just since we already have the black boxes for glass, is there a case to just retain those for the convenience of people using those for overflow of their existing waste?
Possibly. I mean, that's what we've got to work out. The boxes are that size because that's the safe size for people to lift glass with, basically. So potentially it becomes too heavy or dangerous if you put paper and card and all sorts of stuff in it. But those are exactly the sort of questions we've got to work out as we go forward. And as I said, we've had some engagement. We've got 5,500 people who said we'll be involved some more. And those are exactly the sort of questions we can delve into with those people to try to make sure we get a service which suits as many residents of Winchester as possible.
I'll just jump in here with a question around food waste. It's really good that the government has now confirmed some of the specifics around that, and it looks like it's a definite go ahead. What thought has gone into the flexibility in the food bin capacity, given that you have households with potentially 6, maybe even sometimes even more, who are obviously going to generate far more than single households, and the latter often don't have quite so much space. How are we going to manage that kind of, if you like, difference in our public
Good question. I think one of the things we've got is we haven't rolled this out yet, but in Hampshire, Portsmouth do a lot of food waste collection, Eastleigh do food waste collection, Rushmore do food waste collection, and about 30% of the local authorities across the country are currently doing food waste collections. So the government is supporting local authorities, and Project Integra, the Hampshire group, is also supporting them by producing case studies and basically textbooks about how to introduce this in different situations, and how to roll it out, how to engage people, how to model the number of people who are going to use it. So as a really, really easy example, we are working with Biffa at the moment to try and work out how many food waste vehicles we'll need. And that depends upon how many people take part in the collection, and how much food waste they produce. So if you have 50% of households taking part and they produce 1.5 kilos per household per week, you need a different number of vehicles to if you have 75% of households taking part and they produce 2.1 kilos per household per week, for example. We might need 2 more vehicles, which is another £200,000. So we've got to understand and look at really what other people have done and use their experience. So we're working with Biffa, we're working with Project Integra, we're working with the government to look at how we do this. I think one of the key difficult areas for waste collection is communal properties. So we've got quite a lot of communal properties in Winchester, not as many as some other authorities, but there's roughly 10,000 households ish in a communal property. We've just had someone out surveying the communal bin stores for the last 4 or 5 months in and around their other work, and we've got through about half of them, because we still have properties which are in communal properties that don't have glass collections because there's no space for a glass bin. So if the bin store was built 30 years ago, when food waste wasn't a thing, when recycling wasn't a thing, and when glass recycling wasn't a thing, we've got to work out how we get food waste out to everybody. And communal properties is a really interesting question for food waste and for recycling and for residual waste in general. We're going to have to spend some time doing that. But Portsmouth have done it, and Eastleigh have done it, and Rushmore have done it. So it's not impossible, but it's going to take some ideas, some engagement with the community, some engagement with politicians about how to do this and what the best way is to roll this out and develop it.
Well, I'm pleased that you're thinking about that, and you brought up some really good points about the challenges in communal areas. We've certainly got places in Kingsworthy where they have communal bins where we can see there's a need for some upgrades just to have the capacity there. I would say about Eastleigh Borough Council, my father used to live in the Eastleigh Borough Council, and he was one of the people who complained about having this massive bin for his food waste collection. It was too big to put on his worktop. So there's lessons to be learned from the mistakes of other authorities as well as the successes. I think I have a question over on my right side from Councillor Brophy. If anyone else has questions, just catch my eye or catch Councillor Morris's eye.
Thank you, Chair. Possibly a question for Councillor Lerney rather than Campbell. So the process of negotiating between the different WCAs, the different districts, to work out how best to move forward, we obviously have, as per Councillor Greenberg's comments, some mandate based on our survey and the extensive work we've done in terms of how we want to move forward. And we obviously have a fairly ambitious council here in terms of how we want to move forward in terms of getting the best possible outcomes environmentally. What would happen if we are confronted by other authorities who perhaps have a worse financial position or a less degree of ambition? Is that a likely risk based on the conversations you're having? What is the process of negotiating, agreeing that, and coming to an outcome that's actually pleasing to people in Winchester, as opposed to the least worst option that everyone can agree on? Also, given that the deadline was, I think, 1st of March.
Yes, I think that it is going to be quite tricky. It is helpful that our preferred option turns out to be the cheapest option, as it happens, and for that reason, we do anticipate that the majority of other authorities will be in the same position as us and say that they want full commingling. I think where it gets difficult is when county come back with their modelling, which may say that actually they want the waste delivered to them in some kind of different form. The Waste Collection Authority does have the right to tell us how they want waste delivered to them. So at the end of the day, it is a county decision, but it is good news that they are keen to essentially try and meet what the districts want. But as I say, there may need to be some compromises down the line. There is a lot of officer work going on in the background, which I don't know if Campbell wants to briefly talk about that.
Yeah, so we are meeting with the other project integrated partners to understand how we make a decision as a group, because as I think we said, what we ideally want to do is produce the lowest cost system overall, which has the best impact. So Hampshire, Southampton and Portsmouth are the disposal authorities in the partnership. Portsmouth and Southampton have an interesting viewpoint because they're both collection and disposal authorities. So their say in this could be quite interesting, as there's then 14 authorities all told. And there isn't, Hampshire has a large share of the cost to build the infrastructure, but Portsmouth and Southampton share that cost too. So yeah, how we make a decision is going to be quite interesting, and it's a really interesting question how we do that when there may well be competing interests, because it might be cheaper over here for the collection authorities, might be cheaper over here for the disposal authorities. And you're right, we don't necessarily want to go to the lowest common denominator of no ambition and no cost. Because some authorities like Winchester want to be really good at this.
Thank you, Campbell. I've got a couple of, again, practical questions, which I'll try and mop up on a few things. The first one is the intentions in relation to bring sites for extra glass. As I think Councillor Greenberg may have mentioned, there are certain times of year or certain events like World Cups, etc., including the Women's World Cup, I should say, that generate a huge amount of extra glass. So it's conceivable that the commingling approach will cope with the volume most times of the year, but that at certain times of the year there will be an excess of volume. So is it currently, as things stand, our default position that we will continue with bring sites until we've assessed the scale, and then sort of moving on in terms of other practical things? Winchester City Council has done a great job in terms of collecting batteries and small appliances, alongside its normal collections. Am I right, because it hasn't been mentioned, that it's intended that those would be continued to be collected in the same way, or would they go in with the commingling? I've heard recently that vapes, disposable vapes that is, can be collected in the same way. Is that true, or is that an urban myth? And do they get collected as part of batteries or small electricals? Hopefully that gives you a little bit to get your teeth into.
Yes, so the intention is not to change the waste electrical and electronic equipment collections or battery collections, which, just as a reminder, can be collected every week in a plastic bag left alongside or on top of your recycling bin. So that will carry on. You can put vapes in with the waste electrical and electronic equipment, as long as they're not on their own and there's not lots of them, which is quite a difficult message to communicate. So, which is why we haven't really done that yet. So I'm still working with our comms team on the best way to get that message across. So but you can put them in there, and they won't get turned away if you do. So I think that's quite interesting. You're right. Our bring sites, we got, I think, 75 bring sites at the moment across Winchester, the city council area. They are quite popular, especially at Christmas. And we do collect a lot of waste glass or recycled glass through those. We probably also get quite a lot of business glass goes that way. So a number of pubs, restaurants, bars and those sorts of things, or events venues might find it a nice easy way to get rid of lots of glass at low cost. So that might be happening. We've got some decisions to make about if you can put glass in a bin at your house and you can get that collected every 2 weeks, do you need a bottle bank as well? Or do you need some bottle banks in big locations for people who might get through a lot of glass for whatever reason? So those are the sorts of things we've got to work out. Not made those decisions yet. And that might be one of the things that supports having capacity. People do like going to the bottle bank, but equally there are some people who have bottle banks near their house and it's a noise issue. So it's not an easy answer. But again, I think what we've got to do is look at the experience of other authorities who've run the same schemes and see if they have bottle banks or not, and how they get used. We also have paper and card banks at the moment, which you can get recycled at your house, and they get used. So it is possible to provide recycling capacity above what we have at the moment on the curbside. So I think quite possibly, we haven't made any decisions on it, but the way we make decisions, I think, is engage with the community and talk to others who've done this before.
And thank you very much, Campbell. That's really helpful. And it's good to know that, in effect, we're going to try and continue this sort of similar behaviours that we've had so far and evolve them rather than making lots of changes. I guess in the same type of vein, if Tetra Paks and those related products can go into effectively a commingled, then there'll at some point be no longer a need to have separate Tetra Pak collection points, which will free up some space in the places where they currently sit. Okay, thank you for confirming that. Okay, I'll just look round here and see if there's any further questions. I've seen a finger up by, I should say, a hand up by Councillor Brokley rather than a gesture. Thank you, Councillor.
Thank you. Just to follow up on Councillor Bolton's comments earlier about the sample size and actually of the survey and how absolutely impressive that was to have, was it 8,000 responses out of 100,000 people. I guess the concern I have, and it's not a concern, it's just I'm seeking reassurance really. The most important thing, as well as keeping it simple, stupid, is also to bring people with you to make it feel like it's something that they believe in. And obviously, if there's a limited amount of understanding or buy-in, there's always a risk that we could alienate people or leave people behind that could be counterproductive in future. So when you talk about boosting this to people who haven't responded initially, have we taken care to make sure we have reached the parts that are harder to reach, as it were, in terms of some of the people who might not have typically respond to questionnaires on recycling? Because obviously, even though you've got a very high response rate, that could be reflective of the fact that people who care about recycling also happen to overlap with people who fill out questionnaires on recycling. And obviously we've seen that in this the results, we had 3,000 people with a completely full recycling bin and 1,400 people with 3/4 full recycling bin. So over half of the people are actually super duper recyclers of our respondents. How can we reassure people that this is actually we've gone to the extra mile to work out what's going on? Because actually, almost as interesting as the people who are doing this really, really well is how we can make sure we can better communicate and do better for the people who aren't doing so well, bring them with us and actually make them into super recyclers as well. So I don't know if that's a question so much a plea for help, but any reassurance on those points would be helpful.
Yeah, so I think it's a really fair question. And we did deliberately target, once we saw the first set of people who were responding, we did target people who lived in different accommodation, were different age groups, and weren't necessarily as keen recyclers. So we will have got some of those. I think the important thing I think we've got is we've got the opportunity to go back and talk to these people. So we've got their names and addresses. We know who said, I'm not interested in recycling, I don't think it's important. Hopefully, some of the people who said, I'm not that interested, it's not important, we've got their email addresses as well, so we can start targeting some of them to find out why they're not recycling, what they're not interested in. And I think that's part of what we've got to do next, because I think Councillor Lerney and myself and others are quite keen. This isn't something we impose on people, but that we engage with the residents of Winchester to work out how we roll something out which is really good for everybody, and everyone feels part of and wants to support and develop. I think we've got the opportunity to do more engagement, more consultation, because the government's told us what we've got to do. It hasn't told us how we've got to do it, and I think we want to do it really well and have a really good system which drives down, at the end of the day, the overall amount of carbon that we're producing, by producing less waste and recycling as much as possible.
Thank you, Campbell. I think what you're speaking to there is that driving up engagement and recycling requires a communication program, and the right time to do it is as we have introduced the new systems, try and get more people using the new system rather than pushing it on the current system where there might then be changes. So that all makes sense. I would like to throw it open for debate. Do I have any? I've got one of contribution to debate. I'm sure as you speak, Councillor Greenberg, others may be incentivised to join in subsequently.
Oh yeah, they definitely want to have an argument with me, I'm sure. I wonder, have we done any modelling, or could we consider doing any modelling in the relative benefit of kind of pushing more money into the advertising reduction? Like, how much work can we do on reduction and getting people to understand and buy into reduction? And from a financial perspective, does that work out? From an environmental perspective, I can't think of a better word than morality perspective. And obviously, I know that is part of our approach to this, is to prioritise reduction, but thinking about the communications of that as well. Sorry, that's a question rather debate, of course.
If I can take that one, there are definitely cost benefits to reducing waste. Ultimately, if we've got less waste to collect, we need fewer trucks. And obviously it reduces the county costs in terms of dealing with it as well. So it's definitely desirable. Obviously, we're all facing big cost issues at the moment, so it is about balancing that. One of the things we are doing through Project Integra is having a look at those, at how we might advertise better and use the spend that we do have to be more effective in terms of reducing that waste. The consistency regulations are really going to help with that, because we'll be able to give out common messages across the whole county. We know that one of the areas that's really effective in reaching some of those harder to reach groups that you mentioned is radio. Radio is quite difficult for us to do as a district council, because the boundaries are very vague. But as a county, we can definitely look at doing some of that. So certainly looking at some of those things which we don't do very much of at the moment, such as radio advertising. But I think those common advertising messages are going to be important. And that also will reduce the costs, because if we've got 10 districts and the county, Southampton and Portsmouth, all using common materials, then that is going to drive down the cost, and hopefully we'll be able to do it in a really effective way.
Anyone else wishing to contribute to debate, make some statements about what you've heard? I'm not saying, oh, Councillor Bolton, you've just
go on then.
Come in. Yeah.
So just a couple of observations really about some of the, when we've gone through some of the questioning, is that there's clearly, as you said, particularly with the sort of the bottle collection, the size of the container is determined by what your average person that that can actually pick it up physically. And it made me think that, I've observed one of my neighbours regularly under the cover of darkness maybe disposes of more bottles than fit into one of those boxes. And so I know it's a terrible shame. So if we were to assume that by commingling and and putting bottles in with cardboard and all that, well, I'll tell you now, I'm going to need a bigger bin. But we're going to still need the ability to go to a bottle bank, even if we reduce them down and we don't have them in such areas that maybe are a bit antisocial at times. Because I mean, I can think of the one particularly sort of in Petersfield, Waitrose car park. There's time limits on when you can actually visit it because it makes such a racket and there's housing all around it. So I suppose it's just some reflections on, the amount of recycling that goes on at the curb is not the sum total of all recycling. And I think we need to still cater for that, even if it's just at specific centres that are a little bit out of the way and not so, not so antisocial.
Thank you, Councillor Bolton. Councillor Greenberg, are you coming in with a debate point now? Thank you.
It was part of a question I had asked earlier, but actually a point that I'd like to make, which I support that idea. I think that at the moment we've taken out glass recycling from our household waste recycling centre. Well, we have, Hampshire have. And maybe that's a mistake because that's a very manageable entry point, so you can't have businesses going in and recycling there, and it is out of the way, it's quieter, and I think a complete service that would offer that back into the household waste recycling may be a good consideration.
Okay, anyone else for debate? I think I've got Councillor Morris here on my left.
Yeah, I must admit I was initially quite sceptical about the idea of commingling different types of waste, just because the direction of travel up to this point has always been encouraging people to separate their waste into different categories. And now we're basically doing a sort of a volte-face and saying, no, forget all that. You can combine them again. It wasn't a problem after all. And part of my skepticism came from the way it has been portrayed by the government as being a way of sort of disencouraging loony left councils who've now got 8 or 9 multicoloured bins, which I'm not even sure is the case. But I just want to make it clear that our sole motivations here are, firstly, that it will save us money, but secondly, it will increase the amount of recycling. And that is the logic behind this. There is no arbitrary principle of how many bins we think is right. The actual motivation, the logic behind this is just to increase recycling rates.
I have got some comments I want to sum up with, but before we do that, I think there might be an opportunity for the committee to actually just explicitly confirm its support for, based on the information we've had so far, for the commingling approach in the form of a vote. We don't normally do votes, but I thought we could actually indicate that there is support for that. So could I just look around for a show of hands on the support for the implied approach, which is the commingling approach, on the basis that it is simpler for people to use. They don't have to make so many decisions about what goes in, what doesn't go in, and by all accounts it looks like it will be cheaper. So I feel like we have an opportunity to just explicitly state that. So can I have a show of hands, please? I think we've got all of us in support of that, so that's explicitly stated. If there's no further contributions for debate, I will just make a few remarks. So firstly, Campbell, and indeed other officers, thank you for all the hard work you're doing on this. It's not over yet, I'm sure. There's a lot of work's gone into just negotiating with the county council and looking at the legislation as it stands, it still feels like it's closing in, but it's still lots of moving parts and lots of things could change. Like to acknowledge the good work on the survey, and of course the engagement from all our communities, and the work I'm sure has been done by all councillors to promote the survey in their communities. And I think particularly some of the hidden work by officers, such as the communications team that have promoted this throughout the community. So if you could relay our thanks to them. I think the mandate for food waste collection and processing is absolutely fantastic thing. It's been something we've certainly wanted to do, but it's about finding the right opportunity with the funding coming through. So that's good to see. We'd obviously like to see the county council confirm its position on the MRF and whether it can definitely support the commingling. Obviously, based on that vote, we all hope that it will. I think there's a little point that we might need to just start letting people know around the DRS scheme, as and when we're clearer about what that means. There is an implied burden, if you like, on our communities, each household, to collect things that previously they would have just put in the bin if they wish to avail themselves of the DRS. And as someone I think Councillor Lerny pointed out, we anticipate community-led schemes to help those people who perhaps don't have the space to collect those things in large quantities. And I think another key point that came out was, I think there's a strong desire to move to the transport offer that offers it's a real future-proofed base of transport, the least impact on in terms of its carbon footprint, if at all possible. So looking at the schemes that might enable us to do that sooner rather than later. So the obvious thing is electric, but I know there's challenges with not just acquiring the vehicles, but implementing the infrastructure at our sites to charge those vehicles. So those for me were the key points that came out. I hope that resonates with people around the table. And once again, thank you, Campbell, for bringing this paper to us. And with that, I will close the meeting. Thank you very much.